I didn't plan on coming home for the summer. At 28, I'd outgrown the need for childhood bedrooms and backyard barbecues, or so I told myself during the long drive from Chicago. The job at the gallery had ended in May, budget cuts, they said, and suddenly I had nowhere to be except here, in this small town that felt more like a memory than a place I'd actually lived. The house looked smaller than I remembered. The paint on the shutters had faded to a dusty blue, and Dad's prized rose bushes had grown wild along the fence. I pulled into the driveway and sat there for a moment, hands still gripping the steering wheel, watching the curtains twitch in the front window. Mom had been waiting. "Daniel!" She burst through the front door before I'd even turned off the engine, arms already spread wide. "You look thin. Are you eating? Of course you're not eating. I made your favorite, that casserole with the cheese and the—" "I'm fine, Mom." But I let her hug me anyway, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender soap and coffee that always clung to her clothes. Over her shoulder, I could see Dad approaching from the garage, wiping his hands on an old rag. He'd aged since Christmas, more gray at his temples, deeper lines around his eyes, but his smile was the same. "Good to have you home, son." The word home felt strange in my mouth when I tried to echo it back. This place had been my escape route for so long that returning felt like moving backward through time. But I smiled and carried my bags inside, letting the familiar chaos of family love wash over me. It was Mom who mentioned him first, of course. We were sitting at the kitchen table working through our second cup of coffee and catching up on neighborhood gossip when she said casually, "Oh, and Marcus has been such a help while you've been away. Fixed the back steps last month, and just last week he came over to look at that leak in the basement." My coffee cup paused halfway to my lips. "Marcus?" "Marcus Chen," Dad said from behind his newspaper. "You remember Marcus, my friend from work? He's been retired 2 years now, but he still comes around. Good man." I remembered Marcus. I remembered him in ways that made my chest tight and my palms sweat, in ways I'd spent 10 years trying to forget. Marcus Chen, with his quiet voice and steady hands, who'd been a fixture in our house since before I could properly pronounce his name. Marcus, who taught me how to throw a baseball and change a tire and gut a fish without flinching. Marcus, who I'd followed around like a devoted puppy until I was old enough to understand why I never seemed to notice girls the way other boys did. Marcus, who was married, had always been married, to Linda, who made excellent brownies and sent Christmas cards with pictures of their golden retriever. "He'll probably stop by this weekend," Mom continued, oblivious to the way my breathing had gone shallow. "I invited him and Linda to the barbecue on Saturday. You know how your father loves showing off his grilling skills." I nodded and mumbled something appropriate, but my mind was already racing backward, picking through memories I'd carefully packed away years ago. I was 14 the first time I really looked at him, really saw him, not just as Dad's friend who sometimes fixed things around the house, but as something else entirely, something that made my stomach flip and my voice crack when he said my name. It was a camping trip, Dad's annual boys' weekend at the lake, even though by then I was old enough to hate being called a boy. Marcus had driven up separately, arriving just as we finished setting up the tent. I watched him emerge from his truck, all lean muscle and easy confidence, and something shifted inside my chest like a door opening. "Danny," he said, and there it was, that voice, low and warm, dropping just slightly before he said my name like it was something precious. "You've grown." I had grown. I was nearly as tall as him by then, all awkward limbs and teenage uncertainty. But when he looked at me, I felt smaller than ever. Later, when the sun was high and merciless, he'd stripped off his shirt to swim. I'd pretended to read, sprawled on a towel at the water's edge, but my eyes kept drifting to the way the lake water ran down his chest, the way his dark hair curled when it was wet. He moved through the water like he belonged there, powerful and graceful, and I felt something stir in me that I didn't have words for yet. "You coming in?" he'd called, and I'd shaken my head, claiming the water was too cold. Truth was, I didn't trust myself to be that close to him in nothing but swim trunks, didn't trust the way my body might betray me. That night, lying in my sleeping bag with Dad snoring softly beside me, I'd stared up at the stars and tried to name what I was feeling. The word crush seemed too small, too juvenile. This was something deeper, more dangerous. This was the kind of wanting that could ruin everything. Saturday arrived with the kind of perfect weather that made my mother insufferable in her satisfaction. She'd been planning this barbecue for weeks, ever since she'd learned I was coming home, and by 10 in the morning she had me hauling chairs from the garage and stringing lights between the oak trees. The Petersons are coming, and the Garcias, and oh, Mrs. Chen called this morning. She's bringing that potato salad you always liked. Mom paused in her frantic arranging of lawn furniture to give me a meaningful look. You did always like Linda's potato salad. I grunted something noncommittal and focused on untangling Christmas lights in July, trying to ignore the way my heart had started hammering at the mention of the Chen name. By 4 o'clock, the backyard was full of neighbors and the smell of Dad's famous ribs. I'd positioned myself near the drink cooler, playing bartender and trying to look busy. It was a good vantage point. I could see the whole yard, make small talk with whoever wandered by, and keep my hands occupied with ice and bottle caps. I was refilling the beer bucket when I heard his voice behind me. "Danny?" I straightened slowly, ice cubes slipping through my fingers. 10 years of distance collapsed in an instant. He looked older, of course, lines around his eye, silver threading through his black hair, but he was still unmistakably him. Still tall and solid and carrying that particular stillness that had always made me feel like a live wire in comparison. "Marcus," I turned to face him fully, grateful for the cooler between us. "Good to see you." "You too." His eyes moved over my face like he was cataloging changes. "Your mother says you're back for the summer." "For now. Job hunting, you know how it is." He nodded, and for a moment we just stood there, the sounds of the party fading into background noise. This close, I could see the way his hair had gone gray at the temples, the new lines that spoke of years I hadn't been here to witness. But his eyes were the same, dark and careful, like he was always thinking 3 thoughts deeper than whatever he said out loud. "Can I get you a beer?" I managed. "Sure." He accepted the bottle I offered, our fingers brushing for just a second as he took it. "Thanks." We fell into conversation easily enough. Safe topics, surface-level catch-up, his retirement, my job prospects, the eternal struggle of home maintenance. But underneath the polite exchange, I was hyper-aware of everything. The way he stood with his weight shifted slightly forward like he was ready to move at any moment. The way his eyes kept flicking to my mouth when I talked. The way he never looked directly at me when we spoke, but somehow I felt like he was seeing straight through everything I was trying to hide. "Daniel!" Mom's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "Come help me with the dessert table." I excused myself reluctantly, but as I walked away, I could feel his gaze following me. When I glanced back from the kitchen door, he was still standing by the cooler, beer halfway to his lips, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. The rest of the party passed in a blur of small talk and forced smiles. I helped serve dessert, listened to Mr. Garcia's fishing stories, complimented Mrs. Peterson on her garden. But part of my attention was always tracking Marcus across the yard, noting when he laughed at something Dad said, when Linda touched his arm, when he glanced in my direction and looked away just a beat too quickly. As the sun began to set and neighbors started drifting home, I found myself washing dishes at the kitchen sink, watching through the window as the last few guests lingered on the deck. Marcus was helping Dad stack chairs, moving with the easy efficiency of someone who'd done this dozens of times before. Linda was beside Mom, both of them laughing about something as they covered leftover food. Normal, domestic, everything I'd never be able to give him, even if... I shut off that thought before it could fully form and focused on scrubbing barbecue sauce from a plate. Sunday passed quietly. I slept late, helped Mom in the garden, and tried not to think about the way Marcus had looked at me across the yard. By Monday, I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Then Dad asked me to help him organize the garage. "It's gotten out of hand," he said, gesturing at the chaos of tools and lawn equipment and boxes of Christmas decorations. "Your mother's been after me to clean it out for months." We'd been at it for an hour, sorting through decades of accumulated junk, when I heard the familiar sound of Marcus's truck in the driveway. "That'll be Marcus," Dad said without looking up from the box of old paint cans he was examining. "Asked him to take a look at the mower. Thing's been running rough." My heart did something complicated in my chest, but I kept my voice steady. "I can handle the mower if you want to keep sorting." "Nah, Marcus knows more about small engines than both of us put together." "Marcus," Dad called as the garage door rattled open. "Perfect timing. This mower's giving me fits." Marcus appeared in the doorway, backlit by the afternoon sun, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. He was wearing work clothes, faded jeans, and a gray t-shirt that had seen better days, and there was something about seeing him like this, casual and rumpled, that hit me harder than his polished appearance at the barbecue. "Let me take a look," he said, moving to where the mower sat in the corner. I watched his hands as he checked the oil, pulled the spark plug, his movements precise and confident. Those same hands that had taught me to tie knots and bait hooks and hold a wrench properly. "Danny, hand me that screwdriver, would you?" The toolbox was on the workbench behind me. I reached for the screwdriver he needed, and as I turned to give it to him, he was reaching past me for something else. His arm brushed my shoulder, just barely, just for a second, but the contact went through me like electricity. We both froze. I could smell his soap, feel the warmth radiating from his skin. He was close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough that if I turned my head just slightly. Neither of us moved for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. The garage was full of late afternoon light and the smell of motor oil and something else, something charged and dangerous that made my breath catch in my throat. Then Dad's voice cut through the moment. "You find what you need?" Marcus stepped back so quickly it was like he'd been burned. "Yeah, got it." He took the screwdriver from my numb fingers without meeting my eyes and went back to the mower. I stood there for another heartbeat, my shoulders still tingling where he'd touched it, before forcing myself to return to the box I'd been sorting. The rest of the time passed in careful politeness. Marcus fixed the mower, chatted with Dad about baseball, accepted Mom's offer of iced tea. Normal things, safe things. But I caught him looking at me twice, quick glances that he turned away from the moment our eyes met. When he left, he shook Dad's hand and nodded goodbye to me. "See you around, Danny." That night, I lay in my old bed, staring at the ceiling and trying not to think about the way my name sounded in his voice, trying not to replay the moment in the garage over and over, searching for meaning in the space between us. The next few weeks fell into a routine of sorts. I sent out job applications in the mornings, helped around the house in the afternoons, and tried to convince myself that I was imagining the tension that seemed to follow Marcus and me like a shadow. He came by often, more often than I remembered from previous summers. There was always something that needed fixing, some project that required his expertise. Dad welcomed the help, and Mom always insisted he stay for lunch or dinner. I began to recognize the sound of his truck in the driveway, the particular way he knocked on the back door. We were careful around each other, painfully polite. He asked about my job search. I asked about his garden. We talked about books, movies, the weather, anything that didn't require us to look directly at each other for too long. But the awareness was always there, humming beneath the surface of our conversations like a live wire. One evening in late June, I was in the kitchen getting a glass of water when he appeared in the doorway. It was nearly 11 and my parents had gone to bed an hour ago. I hadn't heard him come in. "Couldn't sleep," he said quietly, by way of explanation. I nodded toward the coffee pot. "Want some? It's decaf." "Sure." I poured 2 cups. Hyper-conscious of the silence in the house around us. The kitchen felt smaller with him in it, the familiar space suddenly intimate in a way that made my hand shake slightly as I handed him his mug. We stood on opposite sides of the kitchen island, drinking coffee and not talking. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the distant tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Finally, he spoke. "You used to follow me around like a shadow." The words hit me like a physical blow. I looked up to find him watching me with an expression I couldn't decipher, something between sadness and something else, something that made my pulse quicken. I remember, I said carefully. Do you? His voice was soft, almost wondering. You were always there. Whenever I came over to help your dad with something, there you'd be, watching, learning, asking questions. I was curious. The words came out rougher than I intended. That's one word for it. The silence stretched between us, loaded with everything we weren't saying. I took a sip of coffee to buy myself time, to think of something safe to say. But when I opened my mouth, what came out was, maybe I didn't grow out of it. He went very still. For a long moment, we just looked at each other across the kitchen island, and I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting to see if I'd jump or get pushed. Then he set down his coffee cup with deliberate care and said, I should go. Marcus, I should go, he repeated, but he didn't move, didn't look away. I wanted to say something, anything to keep him here, to bridge the impossible distance between us with words or honesty or some kind of courage I'd never possessed. But before I could find my voice, he was already turning away. Good night, Danny. I listened to his footsteps in the hallway, the soft click of the front door closing, the sound of his truck starting in the driveway. Then I was alone in the kitchen with 2 half-empty coffee cups and the echo of something that felt too much like a confession. The memory came to me 3 days later, triggered by nothing more than the smell of sunscreen and the sound of lawn sprinklers. I was 16, and it was the summer everything changed. The summer I stopped pretending I didn't know what I was feeling, stopped lying to myself about why I watched him the way I did. There had been another camping trip, smaller this time, just Dad and Marcus and me. I was old enough by then to be useful, to carry my own weight, and Marcus treated me more like an equal than the kid I'd always been in his presence. We'd fallen into an easy rhythm over the 3 days. Marcus and I would set up camp while Dad started dinner, then we'd fish until dark and sit around the fire talking about everything and nothing. On the last night, Dad had gone to bed early, complaining of a headache from too much sun. Marcus and I stayed up to bank the fire, moving around each other in the darkness with the familiarity of people who'd done this before. You're quiet tonight, he'd said, settling onto the log we'd been using as a bench. I'd shrugged, not trusting my voice. The truth was, I'd been thinking about college applications, about the life waiting for me beyond this small town, about leaving him behind. Thinking about the future? He'd asked, like he could read my mind. Something like that. He'd nodded, poking at the coals with a stick. You'll do well, whatever you choose. You've got a good head on your shoulders. The praise had warmed me more than it should have. I'd looked over at him in the firelight, the strong line of his jaw, the way the flames painted shadows across his face, and felt that familiar ache in my chest. Marcus, I'd said before I could stop myself. Yeah? Do you ever think about what would have happened if things were different? He'd gone very still. Different how? I'd opened my mouth to answer, to say something that would have changed everything between us, but then Dad had coughed from inside the tent and the moment had shattered like glass. We should get some sleep, Marcus had said, standing abruptly. Early morning tomorrow. He'd never looked directly at me when we talked, but sometimes I felt like he was looking straight through everything I was trying to hide. July brought a heat wave that turned the house into an oven and drove everyone outside in search of relief. I'd taken to running early in the mornings, before the sun could bake the pavement, and it was on one of these runs that I saw Marcus's truck parked outside the hardware store downtown. I slowed to a walk, then stopped entirely when I saw him emerge from the store, a bag of supplies in one hand. He spotted me immediately. I was hard to miss in my running gear, sweaty and breathing hard, and walked over with something that might have been concern. You okay? You look like hell. Thanks, I said dryly, accepting the water bottle he offered from his truck. Nothing like a little heat stroke to start the morning, right? He leaned against the truck bed, watching me drink. We were on Main Street in full view of anyone who cared to look, but something about the early hour and the empty sidewalks made it feel private. Your dad mentioned you might stick around past summer, he said casually. Maybe. Depends on what comes up job-wise. And if nothing comes up? I shrugged. Then I guess I'm a small-town cliché, the guy who never left. There are worse things to be. Something in his tone made me look at him more closely. He was staring down the street toward the old courthouse, his expression distant. You ever think about leaving? I asked. Every day when I was younger. He glanced at me, then away. But life has a way of making choices for you. Is that what happened? Life chose for you? He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, I chose Linda, and Linda chose here. Everything else followed from that. There was something final in the way he said it, like a door closing, but underneath the resignation I heard something else, a kind of weariness that made my chest tight. Do you regret it? The question slipped out before I could stop it. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment his careful mask slipped. I saw something raw in his eyes, something that looked like longing mixed with loss. I should get going, he said instead of answering. Linda's expecting me home for breakfast. I watched him drive away, standing there on the sidewalk in my running shorts with sweat cooling on my skin, and wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night in mid-July. I'd been out with some old high school friends trying to pretend I was 22 again and that small-town bars held the same appeal they once had. By the time I got home, it was after midnight and the house was dark except for the porch light Mom always left on. But as I rounded the corner to the backyard, I saw him. Marcus was sitting on the back porch steps, elbows on his knees, staring out at the dark garden. There was something about his posture, the curve of his shoulders, the way his head was bent, that spoke of exhaustion or defeat or something deeper than either. I should have gone inside. Should have left him alone with whatever had brought him here in the middle of the night. Instead, I found myself walking across the grass, my footsteps loud in the summer silence. He looked up as I approached, and I saw that he had a cigarette between his fingers, the first time I'd seen him smoke in years. Thought you quit, I said, settling onto the step beside him. I did. He took a long drag, exhaled slowly. 10 years ago. He held out the pack without looking at me. I'd never been much of a smoker, but I took one anyway, letting him light it for me with his old Zippo. Our faces were close in the brief flare of the flame, close enough that I could see the exhaustion in his eyes. We sat in silence for a while, sharing the kind of quiet that only comes at 3 in the morning. The air was thick with humidity and the sound of crickets, and somewhere in the distance a dog was barking. Normal summer night sounds that should have been comforting but somehow felt charged with possibility. I shouldn't have come here tonight, he said finally, his voice so quiet I almost missed it. My heart started beating faster. Then why did you? He turned to look at me, and for the first time in years, maybe ever, he didn't look away. Didn't try to hide whatever it was I'd been catching glimpses of in stolen moments and careful conversations. Because I can't stop thinking about you, he said simply. Because every time I see you, I remember why I started smoking in the first place. Because you're 28 years old and I'm married and old enough to know better, but I still can't stay away. The cigarette burned forgotten between my fingers. The whole world had narrowed down to this, his face in the porch light, the raw honesty in his voice, the impossible thing he'd just confessed. Marcus, don't. He stood abruptly, dropping his cigarette and crushing it under his heel. Don't say anything. Don't make this easier or harder than it already is. But he didn't leave. He stood there at the bottom of the steps, hands shoved deep in his pockets, looking at me like I was something he couldn't quite bring himself to walk away from. The silence stretched between us, full of everything we couldn't say and everything we wanted to. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel the summer night pressing down on us like a weight. Then the porch light flickered, probably just a loose bulb, but it broke the spell. Marcus stepped back, shaking his head like he was waking up from a dream. I have to go. I know. He looked at me one more time, his expression unreadable in the shifting light. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing around the side of the house. A moment later, I heard his truck start and pull out of the driveway. I sat there on the porch steps until dawn, smoking cigarettes I didn't want and trying to make sense of what had just happened. Trying to figure out what came next now that we'd both stopped pretending we didn't know what this was. The sun was painting the sky pink and gold by the time I finally went inside, but I could still taste smoke and possibility on my lips. In my chest, and I caught myself listening for the sound of his truck with an intensity that made me feel pathetic. Marcus hasn't been around much this week, Mom observed over dinner, her tone carefully neutral. I hope everything's all right with Linda. Dad looked up from his plate. He mentioned something about visiting her sister in Sacramento, should be back by the weekend. Relief and disappointment warred in my stomach. At least now I knew why the silence had stretched so long, why every creak of the house had made my heart race with anticipation that never came. That night, I walked to the old shed behind the garage, the one Dad used for storage and projects he never quite finished. It smelled like sawdust and motor oil, familiar and comforting in a way that made my throat tight. I was looking through a box of old fishing gear when I heard footsteps on the gravel outside. Danny? My hand stilled on a tangle of yin. His voice was different somehow, rougher, like he'd been driving for hours. In here, I called back, not trusting myself to turn around yet. The shed door creaked as he pushed it open, leaving it half closed behind him. The space felt impossibly small with both of us in it, the late afternoon light filtering through dusty windows to paint everything golden. Thought you were in Sacramento, I said, still not looking at him. Got back an hour ago. He was standing near the door, close enough that I could feel his presence, but far enough that we weren't touching. We need to talk. Now I did turn around. He looked tired, older somehow than he had just a few days ago. His hair was mussed like he'd been running his hands through it, and there were shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. About what? But I knew, we both knew. He was quiet for a long moment, looking everywhere but at me. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. You know this can't happen. The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd been expecting them. Then why does it feel like it already is? He flinched as if I'd struck him. Danny, no, don't. I stepped closer, close enough to see the conflict written across his face. Don't pretend this is one-sided. Don't act like you haven't been feeling it too. Of course I have. The admission came out harsh, angry, but not at me, at himself, at the situation, at whatever cruel joke had landed us here. Do you think this is easy for me? Do you think I wanted to feel this way about you? The shed was thick with summer heat and the weight of everything we weren't supposed to say. I could hear his breathing, slightly uneven, could smell the familiar scent of his soap mixed with something else. Desperation, maybe, or fear. Then what do we do? I asked. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. We don't do anything. I go home to my wife, you finish out the summer and go back to your life, and we pretend this conversation never happened. Is that what you want? The question hung between us like a challenge. For a moment I thought he might actually answer it honestly. His eyes met mine, and I saw something raw and desperate there, something that looked like it might break him open. Then he stepped back, shaking his head. What I want doesn't matter. He was turning toward the door when I said, It matters to me. He stopped but didn't turn around. His shoulders were rigid, his hands clenched at his sides. It can't, he said finally. It has to not matter. Then he was gone, leaving me alone in the shed with the smell of sawdust and the echo of his voice saying my name like a prayer he was afraid to finish. The next few days passed in a haze of careful avoidance. He came by once to help Dad with the gutters, but I made myself scarce, spending the afternoon at the library in town pretending to job hunt. When I got home, his truck was gone and Dad was full of complaints about a loose downspout. Marcus seemed distracted, Dad said over dinner. Not like him to leave a job half-finished. I made non-committal sounds and focused on my food, but I could feel Mom watching me with the particular intensity she reserved for times when she suspected I was hiding something. Saturday morning, she cornered me in the kitchen. You've been moping around here for days, she said without preamble, settling into the chair across from me with her coffee. What's going on? Nothing's going on. I didn't look up from the newspaper I was pretending to read. Daniel, I've been your mother for 28 years. I know when something's bothering you. I could feel her gaze boring into the top of my head, could practically hear the gears turning as she tried to puzzle out what had put me in this mood. The last thing I needed was for her maternal instincts to land on the truth. Just job stuff, I said finally. Rejection letters, you know how it is. She made a sympathetic noise and reached across to pat my hand. Something will come through. You just have to be patient. If only it were that simple. Day ice. The memory surfaced without warning on Sunday afternoon, triggered by the sound of Dad's old radio playing in the garage. I was 12, maybe 13, sitting on the back porch with a book while Dad and Marcus worked on his motorcycle in the driveway. They'd been at it for hours, covered in grease and good-natured arguments about carburetors and timing chains. How'd you two meet anyway? I'd asked during a lull in their conversation. Dad had looked up from the engine, wiping his hands on a rag. Work. Marcus was new to the department, and I got stuck showing him around. Stuck? Marcus had laughed. You volunteered. Because everyone else was too intimidated by your fancy engineering degree. Community college, Marcus had corrected. Hardly fancy. They'd fallen back into their easy rhythm, but I'd watched Marcus work. The careful way he handled tools, the patience he showed when explaining something to Dad, and felt that familiar flutter in my chest that I was still too young to name. Simpler times, Marcus had said later when Dad had gone inside for more beer. He'd been looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Everything made sense back then. I'd nodded like I understood, but I was 12, and everything felt complicated to me. Now, 16 years later, I finally understood what he'd meant. Monday brought rain, the kind of steady summer downpour that sent everyone indoors and made the house feel smaller than usual. I was reading in the living room when I heard the knock at the back door, followed by Mom's voice calling out a greeting. "Marcus, what are you doing out in this weather?" "Sorry to bother you, Helen. Is Tom around?" I wanted to return his socket set. My heart did something complicated in my chest. I closed my book and tried to look casual, like I wasn't straining to hear every word of their conversation. "He's at the hardware store, but he should be back soon. Come in, you're soaked. I'll put some coffee on." "I don't want to impose." "Nonsense. Danny's in the living room if you want some company." I heard his footsteps in the hallway and forced myself to look surprised when he appeared in the doorway. He'd shed his jacket, but his hair was still damp from the rain, curling slightly at the edges in a way that made me want to reach out and touch it. "Hey," he said, hovering near the entrance like he wasn't sure he should come in. "Hey yourself." I gestured to the chair across from me. "Mom's making coffee. You might as well sit." He settled into Dad's usual chair, and we fell into the kind of stilted conversation we'd been having since that night on the porch. Safe topics, careful words, both of us working hard to pretend we weren't hyper-aware of every breath, every gesture, every loaded pause. But something was different today. There was a restlessness in the way he sat, a tension in his shoulders that spoke of decisions being wrestled with. When Mom brought the coffee and retreated to the kitchen, he finally looked directly at me. "I've been thinking about what you said, in the shed." My pulse quickened. "Which part?" "All of it." He took a sip of coffee, his hands not quite steady. "You asked what I wanted." "And?" He was quiet for so long I thought he'd changed his mind about having this conversation. Outside, the rain drummed against the windows with increasing intensity, creating a cocoon of white noise around us. "I've been loyal to a lot of things in my life," he said finally. "Maybe too loyal." The words hung between us, heavy with implication. I wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to push for more, but something in his expression warned me off. This was as much honesty as he could manage right now. "That's not always a bad thing," I said carefully. "Isn't it?" He looked at me then, and I saw something desperate in his eyes. What if loyalty becomes a cage? What if the thing you're being loyal to isn't even real anymore? Before I could answer, we heard Dad's truck in the driveway. Marcus straightened in his chair, and just like that, the moment was over. The mask slipped back into place, and by the time Dad came through the front door, we were discussing baseball scores and the weather like two people who'd never shared a loaded silence. But I could still feel the weight of his words, the implication that something in his carefully constructed life was fracturing. And part of me, the part I'd been trying to ignore, wondered if I was the cause or just the catalyst. The lake had always been our family's refuge, a small spring-fed circle of water about 10 miles outside town, surrounded by pines and accessible only by a winding dirt road. Dad had brought me here to fish when I was small, and later as a teenager I'd come alone when I needed to think. I wasn't expecting to find Marcus there on Wednesday afternoon. I'd driven out on impulse, needing to escape the suffocating politeness that had settled over every interaction since the rain-soaked conversation in the living room. The parking area was empty except for his truck, and for a moment I considered turning around and leaving. But something, curiosity maybe, or the masochistic need to torture myself further, made me get out and walk down to the water. He was sitting on the old wooden dock, legs dangling over the edge, staring out at the lake like he was trying to memorize it. He didn't turn around when he heard my footsteps, but his shoulders tensed slightly. "Didn't expect to see anyone else here," he said without looking back. "I can go." But I didn't move. "No, stay." He shifted over slightly, making room on the dock beside him. Could use the company. I settled next to him, careful to leave space between us, and followed his gaze out over the water. It was perfectly still, reflecting the late afternoon sky like a mirror. Peaceful in a way that made the turmoil in my chest feel even sharper by contrast. "Linda used to love this place," he said after a while. "When we first moved here, we'd come out every weekend. Pack a lunch, swim, just be together? Something in his tone made me look at him more closely. There was a sadness there, a kind of quiet grief that spoke of more than just nostalgia. She doesn't anymore? He shrugged. She says it's too quiet, prefers the community pool in town. A pause. Maybe she's right. Maybe there's too much space here to think. The silence stretched between us, comfortable despite everything. A fish jumped near the far shore, sending ripples across the perfect surface, and somewhere in the trees behind us, a bird was calling to its mate. I used to think I knew exactly who I was, he said finally, his voice so quiet I almost missed it over the gentle lap of water against the dock. My heart started beating faster. And now? Now I'm not so sure. He picked up a stone from beside the dock and turned it over in his hands, examining it like it held answers. You spend so long being one thing, playing one role, that you forget there might be other possibilities. I wanted to ask what possibilities he was thinking about, wanted to push for more honesty, but something about the way he was holding himself, carefully like he might break, warned me to be gentle. Maybe that's not such a bad thing, I said instead. Not being sure, I mean. Maybe it means you're still growing. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. At 52, I think I'm a little old for growing pains. Are you? The question made him turn to look at me, and for a moment we just stared at each other. This close, I could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, could count the silver threads in his hair, could see the exact moment when his careful composure started to crack. Danny, he said, and my name sounded like a warning and a plea rolled into one. I know. I looked away, back out at the water. I know we can't. I know all the reasons why this is impossible, but knowing doesn't make it stop. He was quiet for a long time, still turning the stone over in his hands. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I dream about you. The confession hit me like a physical blow. I turned to stare at him, but he was looking out at the water again, his jaw tight with the effort of admitting something he'd probably been fighting for weeks. Marcus, I dream about you, and I wake up hating myself for it. I come here to clear my head, and all I can think about is how you looked that night on the porch, how you said my name. The stone slipped from his fingers and disappeared into the water with a soft splash. I'm 52 years old, Danny. I should know better. Maybe knowing better is overrated. He turned to look at me then, and I saw something break open in his expression. Something raw and desperate and so full of longing it made my chest ache. You don't know what you're saying. Don't I? For a moment I thought he might close the distance between us, thought he might finally stop fighting whatever this was and let it happen. His eyes dropped to my mouth and I could see him wavering, see the careful control he'd built around himself starting to crumble. Then a car door slammed in the parking area behind us and the spell was broken. He jerked back like he'd been burned, putting physical distance between us just as a family with small children came trooping down toward the water. I should go, he said, already standing. I wanted to protest, wanted to grab his hand and make him stay, make him finish whatever it was he'd been about to say, but the moment was gone, replaced by the careful politeness we'd been hiding behind for weeks. Marcus, I called as he started back toward the parking area. He stopped but didn't turn around. For what it's worth, I said, I dream about you too. His shoulders went rigid, and for a heartbeat I thought he might turn around, might come back and damn the consequences. Instead, he just nodded once and kept walking. I sat on the dock until the sun set, watching the water and trying to make sense of what had just happened. Trying to figure out what came next, now that we'd both admitted there was something here worth dreaming about.
Guys, foundation may blur day and for
To drop off to borrowed at beyond I felt his presence physical when he was in the air, followed him, and sometimes when I thought he wasn't looking, I'd catch him watching me with an expression that made my pulse race and my hand shake. Friday afternoon found me in Dad's old truck, driving back from an unsuccessful job interview in the next town over. The position had been wrong from the start. Corporate, soulless, the kind of work that would have slowly killed whatever was left of my creativity. But I'd gone through the motions anyway, desperate for any excuse to leave town before I did something we'd both regret.
I was so lost in thought that I almost missed the turn for home. Almost drove straight past the familiar intersection and kept going, following the highway toward anywhere that wasn't here. But at the last second, I turned the wheel and found myself pulling into our driveway, no closer to an answer than I'd been that morning. Mom was in the garden, weeding the tomatoes with the single-minded determination she brought to all domestic crises. She looked up as I got out of the truck, shading her eyes against the late afternoon sun. How did it go? Not great. I joined her among the plants, grateful for something to do with my hands. Wrong fit. She made a sympathetic noise and handed me a pair of gardening gloves. Something better will come along. These things have a way of working out. I wished I had her faith. Right now it felt like nothing was working out the way it was supposed to. We worked in comfortable silence for a while, the familiar rhythm of weeding and watering soothing in a way I hadn't expected. This was the garden I'd helped plant as a child, the same rows of vegetables and flowers that had fed our family for decades. There was something comforting about the continuity of it, the way some things remained constant even when everything else felt like it was shifting. Danny? Mom's voice was carefully neutral, the tone she used when she was fishing for information. Is everything all right between you and Marcus? My hand stilled on a tomato plant. What do you mean? You've both been different lately, polite in a way that doesn't feel quite natural. She sat back on her heels, studying me with the particular intensity that had always made it impossible to lie to her. Did something happen? No. The word came out too quickly, too defensive. Nothing happened. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. Something had happened, was still happening, in all the spaces between our careful words and loaded silences. In the way he said my name like it cost him something, in the way I found excuses to be wherever he was. Mom was still watching me, and I could see her putting pieces together with the methodical precision she brought to everything from gardening to gossip. The last thing I needed was for her to figure out what those pieces meant. We're fine, I said, focusing on the weeds with unnecessary intensity. Just, adult stuff, jobs, life changes. It's complicated. She accepted this non-answer with the grace of someone who'd raised a son through adolescence and knew when to push and when to let things be. But I could feel her worry like a weight in the air between us, another complication in an already impossible situation. That evening, after dinner and the usual family rituals, I found myself walking aimlessly through the neighborhood. The summer night was thick with humidity and the sound of crickets, and lights glowed warmly in windows as families settled in for the evening. Normal lives, normal problems. I envied them the simplicity. I was passing the Chen's house when I saw him in the backyard, sitting alone on their porch. Linda's car wasn't in the driveway, and something about his posture, the way his shoulders curved inward, the careful stillness of his hands, spoke of someone wrestling with thoughts too heavy to carry. I should have kept walking, should have minded my own business and let him work through whatever was troubling him. Instead, I found myself pushing through their gate and walking across the lawn toward him. He looked up as I approached, his expression cycling through surprise, wariness, and something else I couldn't quite name. "Danny, what are you doing here?" "Saw you sitting out here. Thought you might want some company." He gestured to the chair beside him, Linda's chair with its cheerful cushions and the small table where she kept her iced tea. I hesitated for a moment, aware of the symbolism, then sat down anyway. "Linda's at her book club," he said as if reading my thoughts. "Won't be back until late." We sat in silence for a while, listening to the distant sound of traffic and the whisper of wind through the trees. Their backyard was neat and well-maintained, everything in its proper place, a shrine to domestic contentment that felt like a rebuke to whatever this was between us. "I've been thinking about what you said at the lake," I said finally. He went very still. "What about it?" "About not knowing who you are anymore." I looked over at him, taking in the familiar lines of his profile. "I think I've known who I was since I was 16, since that camping trip when I watched you swim and realized what I was feeling wasn't going away." He closed his eyes like the words were physically painful. "Danny, I'm not asking for anything," I said quickly. "I'm not asking you to leave Linda or make any grand gestures. I needed you to know that this isn't new for me. This isn't some quarter-life crisis or confusion about what I want." When he opened his eyes, they were bright with something that looked suspiciously like tears. "You think that makes it easier?" "No, I think it makes it real." The silence that followed was different from our usual careful quiet. This felt charged, dangerous, like we were standing on the edge of something that would change everything once we stepped over it. "I should go," I said, but I didn't move. "You should," he agreed, but his voice was rough with something that sounded like the opposite of agreement. Neither of us moved. We sat there in Linda's chairs in the backyard of the life he'd built without me and let the impossible weight of what we wanted settle between us like a living thing. Finally, he spoke. "She's talking about moving, Linda, closer to her sister in California." My heart stopped. "When?" "After Christmas, maybe. She's been unhappy here for a while, says it's too small, too quiet, too full of memories." "And you?" He was quiet for a long time, staring out at the garden Linda had planted with such care. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I used to think home was a place, a house, a job, a life you built with someone." He looked at me then, and I saw something break open in his expression. "But lately, I think it might be simpler than that. I think it might just be wherever you stop pretending to be someone you're not." The words hung between us like a confession, like a promise, like the most dangerous thing either of us had ever said out loud. I was about to respond when we heard Linda's car in the driveway. The spell broke instantly, Marcus straightening in his chair, me jumping to my feet like I'd been caught stealing. "I should go," I said again, this time meaning it. "Danny." His voice stopped me at the edge of the porch. "Thank you for listening." I nodded and slipped away through the gate, my heart pounding with the weight of everything we'd almost said. Behind me, I heard Linda's voice calling out a greeting, heard Marcus's response, warm, normal, the sound of a man settling back into the role he'd been playing for 20 years. But I could still feel the echo of his words, the dangerous honesty in his voice when he'd talked about home. And for the first time since I'd come back to this small town, I wondered if maybe I wasn't the only one who'd been pretending to be someone I wasn't. Saturday morning brought the kind of August heat that made moving seem like a monumental effort. I was lying in bed listening to the air conditioners strain against the humidity when Mom knocked on my door. "Danny, phone for you." I stumbled downstairs in my pajama pants, squinting against the bright kitchen light. The phone was ancient, a corded model that had probably been new when I was in high school, and I had to stretch the cord to get any privacy. "Hello?" "It's me." Marcus's voice was low, careful. Can you meet me somewhere? We need to talk. My pulse quickened. When? Now, if you can. The old barn behind the Hendersons' place. You know the one? I knew it. Abandoned for years, hidden from the road by a stand of oak trees. The kind of place teenagers went to drink beer and carve their initials into the walls. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The barn was exactly as I remembered it. Weathered wood and rusted hinges, hay still scattered on the floor from whatever livestock had been kept there decades ago. Marcus was already there when I arrived, sitting on an overturned crate near the back wall. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that filtered through the gaps in the boards, and the air smelled like old wood and summer heat. He looked up as I entered, and I could see the exhaustion in his face, the weight of sleepless nights and careful conversations. "Thanks for coming," he said. I found another crate and dragged it over, close enough to talk quietly, but far enough away that we were not touching. The barn felt like a confessional, all shadows and whispered secrets. "What did you want to talk about?" He was quiet for a long time, hands clasped between his knees, staring at the hay-strewn floor. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with the effort of saying something he'd been holding back. "I can't do this anymore." My heart sank. "Can't do what?" "This. Pretending. Acting like I don't feel what I feel, like I don't want what I want." He looked up at me then, and I saw something desperate in his eyes. "It's killing me, Danny. The lying, the careful distance. I wake up every morning and have to remember to be someone I'm not." The barn was thick with heat and the weight of his words. I could hear my own breathing, slightly uneven, could see the way his hands were shaking just slightly. "Then don't," I said quietly. "It's not that simple." "Isn't it?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm married, Danny. I have a life, responsibilities. I can't just what? Be honest about what you want?" "What I want doesn't matter. It matters to me." The words came out fiercer than I'd intended, and he flinched like I'd struck him. But something in his expression shifted, some carefully maintained wall starting to crumble. "You don't understand," he said. "This isn't just about me. Linda, your parents, this whole town. If people knew what I was feeling, what I've been thinking about. What have you been thinking about?" The question hung between us like a challenge. For a moment, I thought he might actually answer it honestly, might finally give voice to whatever had been building between us all summer. Instead, he stood up abruptly, pacing to the far end of the barn. I should go. This was a mistake. "Don't." I stood too, closing some of the distance between us. "Don't run away again." "I'm not running." "Yes, you are. You've been running since that night on the porch, since the conversation in the shed. Every time we get close to saying what this is, you disappear." He spun around to face me, and I saw something wild in his eyes, something that looked like it might break him open. "Because I can't say it. Because once I say it out loud, it becomes real and I can't take it back." "Maybe you don't want to take it back." The silence that followed was deafening. We stood there in the dusty barn, surrounded by the ghosts of other people's lives, and let the truth settle between us like something alive and dangerous. Finally, he moved back to his crate, sinking down like the weight of standing had become too much. I followed, settling beside him, closer this time, close enough that our knees were almost touching. "Tell me about Linda," I said quietly. He looked at me like I'd asked him to solve a complex equation. "What about her?" "How you met, what it was like in the beginning." He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer, then slowly he began to speak. "College, she was in my chemistry class, and I was so shy back then. Could barely string two sentences together around women." A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "She asked me out. Can you believe that? This beautiful, confident woman saw something in me I didn't even know existed." "What was it like, being with her?" "Safe," he said without hesitation. "Easy, she made decisions, I followed along. She wanted to get married, we got married. She wanted to move here, we moved. For 20 years, I never had to think about what I wanted because she wanted enough for both of us. And now? He looked at me then, and I saw something break open in his expression. Now I'm sitting in a barn with my best friend's son, talking about things I've never said out loud, and I can't remember the last time I felt this much like myself. The words hit me like a physical blow. I could see him wavering, could see the careful control he'd built around himself starting to crumble piece by piece. Without thinking, I reached out and covered his hand with mine. He went completely still. We both stared down at our joined hands, mine pale and long-fingered, his darker scarred from years of working with tools. The contact sent electricity shooting up my arm, and I could feel his pulse racing under my fingertips. "Danny," he said, and my name sounded like a warning and a prayer rolled into one. I know, but I didn't pull away, neither did he. We sat there in the dusty barn with our hands touching, both of us afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid to do anything that might break whatever spell had settled over us. The silence stretched between us, heavy with everything we weren't saying, everything we wanted but couldn't reach for. He never promised anything, never touched me beyond that simple contact of hands. But in the silence, I felt more undone than if he had stripped me bare and laid me down in the hay. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, he pulled his hand away. The loss of contact was like a physical pain. "I should go," he said, but his voice was rough, uncertain. "Okay." Neither of us moved. "Danny," he said finally, "I need you to know, this isn't a game for me. This isn't some midlife crisis or a moment of weakness. What I feel for you, it's real. It's been real for longer than I care to admit." My throat closed up. "How long?" "Since you came home that first day, since I saw you get out of the car and realized you weren't a kid anymore." He stood up slowly like it took all his strength. "Maybe longer than that, if I'm being honest. Maybe since you were 16 and looked at me like I was something worth wanting." The confession hung between us like something fragile and precious. I wanted to reach for him, wanted to close the distance and damn the consequences. But something in his posture warned me that he was already stretched to his breaking point. "What happens now?" I asked. "I don't know." He moved toward the barn door, then stopped, looking back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "But Danny, whatever happens, I want you to know. You didn't imagine this. What's between us, it's real. It's the most real thing I've felt in years." Then he was gone, leaving me alone in the barn with the smell of old hay and the echo of words that felt like both a promise and a goodbye. The rest of Saturday passed in a blur of family obligations and forced normalcy. Mom dragged me to the farmer's market where I made appropriate noises about tomatoes and sweet corn while my mind replayed every moment in the barn. That evening, Dad grilled burgers and we ate on the back porch, making small talk about the weather and my job prospects while I tried not to scan the neighboring yards for any sign of Marcus. Sunday was worse. We went to church, the same small congregation I'd grown up in, full of familiar faces and whispered gossip about who was dating whom and whose kids were causing trouble. I sat in the pew between my parents trying to focus on the sermon about forgiveness and redemption. But all I could think about was the way Marcus had looked at me in the barn, the desperate honesty in his voice when he'd said it was real. Monday brought a call from a gallery in Portland, not a job exactly, but a chance to show some of my work in a group exhibition. It was the kind of opportunity I'd been hoping for, the kind of thing that could open doors if I played it right. "That's wonderful, honey," Mom said when I told her over breakfast. "When would you need to be there?" "Next week, ideally. There's a reception on Friday and they want the artist there to meet potential buyers." She nodded, already making mental lists of what I'd need to pack, what connections she could call in Portland to help me network. It was exactly the kind of support I'd always been able to count on from my family, and it made the weight in my chest feel even heavier. "How long would you be gone?" Dad asked. I shrugged, not meeting his eyes. "Hard to say. Could be a few days, could be longer if something comes of it." What I didn't say was that part of me was already too, I'd see, so Bye.